Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You ever sit at a table full of people who share your blood and realize, with a gut punch clarity, that if you keeled over right then and there, not a damn one of them would notice until dessert? That's where I was, right in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, when Mom raised her glass of Pinot Grigio and chirped across the table. We finally paid off Amanda's student loans. She can start her new job in DC debt-free. Everyone clapped, like she'd just announced a Nobel Prize or something. And before I could process the sting of that revelation, she turned to me, half laughing, half pitying, and added, "And don't worry, hun, you'll figure life out eventually." That was it, my big Thanksgiving toast. Not even a question about how I was doing, or if I needed help. Just a condescending pat on the head like I was some kid who lost their mittens. I smiled, not because I was okay, but because I knew, right then, that staying quiet would speak louder than anything I could say. And I had something in my back pocket they weren't ready for. I just didn't know how ready I was to use it. Let me paint the picture. We're sitting around Mom and Dad's long mahogany table in their colonial-style house out in a Connecticut suburb that screams upper-middle-class pride. It's got that we struggle but not really energy. Amanda, my sister, is beaming. Her teeth are perfect. She's the kind of person who updates LinkedIn for fun. She went Ivy, got a policy job lined up, and apparently a clean financial slate, courtesy of the parental bank. Me, I went state school, worked 2 jobs during undergrad, got a psychology degree I'm not using, and currently sling espresso drinks and train corporate folks on soft skills 3 days a week. It's a patchwork life. Not glamorous, but it's mine. And still, every holiday is the same. Amanda gets flowers, I get silence, or worse, those little barbs wrapped in passive concern. You're still doing that coffee thing, huh? Or is there room for growth in that sort of lifestyle? They say lifestyle like it's a drug habit. What they don't know is that despite the hustle, I'm managing my own student loans without a bailout, and I've never asked them for a dime. Not once. But apparently, silence doesn't get you praise at this table. It gets you erased. I pushed the stuffing around on my plate and kept my face neutral. Dad hadn't said much. He never does during these scenes, just nods and pours more gravy. He's got this way of shrinking into the background when Mom takes the stage. But I caught it, that twitch in his eye when she said they paid off Amanda's loans. It was subtle, but it was there, and it stirred something in my gut. Not because of what he did, but because of what I knew. See, 2 weeks ago, I stopped by unannounced. I don't do it often, mostly because I don't like surprises, and neither do they. But I'd been in the area, and I had a key, still on my ring from college days, when I'd stop by for leftovers and laundry. The house was quiet when I came in, and I heard Dad's voice in the den. I wasn't eavesdropping, not at first, but I stood there, frozen, when I heard my name come out of his mouth. I just can't tell her. She'd never look at me the same. I don't know who he was talking to. Maybe a friend, maybe someone on the phone, but he sounded scared. The kind of scared that doesn't go away after one bad choice. That night, I walked into his office and found a half-written letter folded under a stack of bills. I didn't read the whole thing, just the first few lines. It was addressed to me. It started with, "I'm sorry." I'd taken it, not to punish, but to understand. And now, 2 weeks later, that envelope was sitting in a small gift box next to Dad's plate, wrapped in the same silver and gold paper Amanda's fancy new iPad came in. Nobody noticed when I slipped it there. Nobody even saw me carry it in. But he saw it now, next to his plate, and for the first time that evening, his hand was trembling. As Mom laughed about Amanda's upcoming trip to Paris, paid for with the money they used to spend on loans, I leaned back and watched Dad look down at the box. He didn't touch it, not right away. His fork hovered midair, then clattered softly onto the plate. I said nothing, not when Mom asked if I was seeing anyone, not when Amanda asked if I'd applied to real jobs lately. I let their words wash over me, a chorus of blind superiority and practiced ignorance. I'd played the quiet one my whole life, the one who didn't need help, who wasn't as impressive but was reliable, whatever that meant. But tonight, I wasn't quiet because I didn't know what to say. I was quiet because I was waiting. Then came the part everyone loves, presents. Mom started the tradition a few years ago, one little gift per person at Thanksgiving. To show gratitude, she said, but really it was a stage for Amanda's achievements to shine even brighter. Amanda got her iPad with a custom engraved case. My gift was a candle, lavender like always, because apparently I seemed stressed. Sure. Then Dad picked up the silver box. His fingers were stiff, and I could tell by the way he held it that he already knew it wasn't from Mom. He opened it slowly, peeled back the tape like it might bite him. Inside was the envelope. His face went white, not like shock, but like he'd just seen the ending of a story he'd been hoping would never come. He looked at me across the table. I smiled, and I didn't say a single word. After Dad unwrapped the silver ball and laid eyes on that plain envelope, his hands stiff like he was trying not to let on how much it rattled him. The room didn't go quiet in the dramatic movie-style way you might imagine. No, people kept chewing. Mom kept talking about how Amanda had been invited to some networking brunch with a senator's aide, and even Amanda let out a half-hearted chuckle, as if my silence was just another one of those quirky middle child things they never bothered to unpack. But I saw it, clear as day, in the way Dad's face drained of color, like someone had pulled the plug on his bloodstream, and for 1 second, I almost felt bad. Almost. The envelope hadn't changed since the day I found it tucked under a half-signed check and a stack of retirement paperwork on his desk. There was nothing flashy about it. No monogram, no elegant script. Just my name, Emily, in his handwriting that I'd seen on birthday cards and report cards and excuse notes back when I still got colds often enough to miss school. But the weight of that envelope, sitting now between his fingers and unopened, was something I could feel even across the table, like a physical shift in gravity. He didn't open it right away. He folded the top flap of the box back down, as if trying to pretend it hadn't happened, like maybe if he waited long enough the envelope would disappear. Mom didn't notice. She was on her third glass of wine and gushing about how Amanda might even get featured in a local magazine's Top 30 Under 30 segment. Amanda preened, obviously delighted, as she ran a French manicured nail around the rim of her wine glass, like she was conducting a symphony of subtle superiority. I wasn't part of their music. I never had been. What none of them knew, not yet, was that the envelope didn't just contain words. It contained power, and not the kind you swing around to break things or win arguments, but the kind you let simmer, tucked away in a drawer, until the time is right. That's why I hadn't opened it in front of them, because sometimes, when people write confessions, they do it not for forgiveness, but to relieve themselves of the guilt they're too cowardly to face head-on. I had read enough of that letter to know that it was unfinished, incomplete, and yet heavy with consequence. That night, when I'd found it, I'd tucked it in my bag and waited. Not out of malice, but because I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. But now, watching Dad stare at it like it had grown teeth, I knew exactly what I felt. Control. Dinner dragged on like it always did in our house. Too much butter, too many stories about Amanda's college days, and just enough backhanded compliments thrown my way to remind me that I was never the one they bet on. I played along, laughed when I was expected to, nodded when I was addressed. But all the while, I watched that envelope sit next to Dad's untouched slice of pie. It was like a landmine, just waiting. Later that evening, after the table had been cleared and Amanda had disappeared into the living room with a glass of something expensive to video chat with her college friends, I stepped into the den, just to breathe. The house always felt colder during the holidays, like the warmth was reserved for people who met certain standards. The fire was going, but it felt fake, like the whole damn thing was just for show. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting maybe Mom, ready to scold me for not being enthusiastic enough during Amanda's loan announcement. But it was Dad. He stood in the doorway like a man preparing for a trial, holding the letter, still sealed. "I wasn't ready for you to see this," he said, voice low, like Amanda might overhear from the other room, even with the distance between us. "You wrote it," I replied, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, heart thumping harder than I wanted to admit. "Why now?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he stepped inside, closed the door softly, and sat down on the old leather chair that used to be his reading spot before screens took over every room of the house. He placed the envelope on the side table like it was a truce flag. "There are things you don't understand," he said, and I laughed, short and sharp, not because it was funny, but because that line was such a worn-out cliché. It barely registered as meaningful. "I understand enough," I said, because I did. I understood that while Amanda's education had been a priority, mine had been a burden. I understood that when she came home crying over midterms, Mom made her tea and called professors, and when I came home with the flu and overdue bills, they told me to budget better. I understood that they saw her as an investment, and me as a sunk cost. "I never meant for it to be like this," he said, and it sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced that line in front of a mirror for years. "Then what did you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious, because if he was about to beg for sympathy or explain it away with some half-baked excuse, I wanted to hear just how far he'd go to convince himself he hadn't failed me. He reached for the envelope again, but didn't open it. Instead, he handed it to me. "You should read it." "I did," I said, and I didn't miss the way his eyes widened. Just a little, that's when I realized. He didn't know I'd already read it. He thought this moment, this little private confession, was going to be his big act of redemption, but he was too late. The words were already mine, and I was still deciding what to do with them. I didn't tell him that. Not yet. Instead, I tucked the envelope back into my bag, gave him one long look that I hoped said all the things I didn't feel like spelling out, and walked out of the room. He didn't follow. Later, when I checked my bag again before heading upstairs to the guest room, the envelope was gone. Someone else had taken it. I didn't panic right away, not because I wasn't furious or confused, but because I've spent enough time with my family to know that losing your cool is just about the fastest way to give up power. And in that house, power is the only currency that doesn't lose value when the economy tanks or your daughter turns out less than marketable. I sat on the edge of the two-firm guest bed, the one that still had a floral comforter from my high school years and a shelf full of trophies that didn't belong to me, and I stared into the open mouth of my bag, feeling my pulse rise slowly like water in a pot set to boil. The envelope was gone, completely, not folded under receipts, not stuck behind the zipper pocket where I sometimes tossed chapstick and old gum, just gone. And there was no doubt in my mind that it hadn't just vanished into thin air. Someone had taken it. There were only 3 people in the house who could have done it: Mom, Amanda, or Dad. And while Dad seemed more shaken than scheming, I wasn't about to rule him out just because he looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last 3 hours. If he'd found the courage or desperation to write that letter in the first place, he might have also found the nerve to try to erase it, especially now that he knew I'd read it. But something about his body language in the den, the sag in his shoulders, the hollow sound in his voice when he said, "I never meant for it to be like this," made me think he didn't have the energy left to pull off a stealth mission. No, if I had to guess, I'd say Amanda had gotten wind of something. She'd always had a way of sniffing out secrets like it was a sixth sense. And even though she acted like my presence barely registered with her, I wouldn't put it past her to rifle through my stuff if she thought there was drama involved. Or worse, something that might affect her spotless reputation. The woman had a black belt in self-preservation, and Mom, well, she'd pretend she didn't have the time for that kind of petty invasion of privacy, but I'd watched her go through my trash once in college after she suspected I'd thrown out the rosary she gave me for protection. Spoiler alert, I had. So no, I couldn't count her out either. I waited until after midnight, when the house got quiet and the wine glow had worn off. I crept downstairs, not in a cartoonish, exaggerated way, but carefully, in that precise, deliberate manner that only people who have grown up hiding parts of themselves know how to do. The hall light near the study was on. That was strange. Nobody used that room anymore since Dad moved his laptop to the kitchen, and Mom discovered her tablet could stream cooking videos from the couch. I peeked around the doorway, and sure enough, Amanda was inside. She wasn't on a call. She wasn't sipping tea or adjusting her travel itinerary. She was sitting at the desk, eyes fixed on something in front of her. And even though I couldn't see what it was, I didn't need to, I knew. She looked up and saw me before I could pull back. Her face didn't flinch, didn't show guilt or surprise, just a sort of mild annoyance, like I'd interrupted her mid-scroll on Instagram. "I figured you'd come looking," she said, her voice too calm, like this was some negotiation and not a complete invasion of privacy. "You took it," I said, not asking, not accusing, just stating it flatly like weather. The envelope lay on the desk in front of her, unopened, though the seal was bent slightly, as if she'd toyed with the idea. She leaned back in the chair, crossing her arms like she was settling in for a debate. "I didn't read it," she said, and again, it wasn't a defense, it was a decision. I didn't have to. The look on Dad's face at dinner told me everything I needed to know. "What exactly do you think you know?" I asked, stepping into the room, not because I wanted a fight, but because I needed her to understand that this wasn't a game she was going to win. Amanda tilted her head like she was examining something under a microscope. "I know Dad's hiding something, and I know it involves money. And if it involves money, then it's going to affect all of us." "All of us?" I laughed, not because it was funny, but because she had the nerve to act like we were on equal footing in this house. "Is that why he paid off your loans and not mine? Because we're all in this together?" She didn't blink. "That wasn't my decision." "But you didn't say no," I said, and that finally got a reaction. Her jaw tensed, just slightly. It was enough. "I've worked hard for everything I have," she said, the line she always pulled out like a badge of honor, as if having rich parents who covered your tuition and fed you name-brand cereal somehow canceled out privilege. I stepped closer to the desk, letting my eyes land on the envelope. "Hard work doesn't buy silence," I said, softer now. And I watched her eyes flick to the paper, just briefly, like it was still calling to her. She stood up then, quickly, and pushed the envelope toward me. "Take it. It's yours, but don't pretend you're the only one who's been wronged in this family." I wanted to laugh again, but I didn't. I took the envelope, folded it carefully, and tucked it inside my shirt, close to my skin. "I'm not pretending," I said, turning to leave. I just finally stopped letting it slide. Back in my room, I didn't sleep. I lay there with the letter on my chest, heart pounding, not because I was afraid of what would happen next, but because I finally felt awake, alive. The balance had shifted. Amanda knew it, Dad felt it, and Mom? She'd be the last to catch up, but when she did, it was going to hit her like a freight train. Because the letter's grip wasn't just on Dad anymore, it was on all of us. By morning, the entire house had the tight-lipped atmosphere of a courtroom just before the verdict. No one speaking above a murmur, everyone moving carefully as if trying not to set off a bomb whose trigger they couldn't quite locate, yet all sensing that something irreversible had been set in motion. The only person who seemed remotely unaware, or was doing a masterful job pretending, was Mom, who, clad in a bright floral apron that didn't match the muted gray of her morning mood, fluttered about the kitchen with the kind of performative energy only she could muster after a holiday that had turned into a slow-motion implosion. She offered coffee in that voice that stretched too sweet, as if the sugar might cover up the fact that her world, or at least the narrative she clung to with white-knuckled denial, was starting to fray at the edges. I declined. I didn't trust anything coming out of that kitchen. Amanda was already seated at the breakfast nook, scrolling through her phone with the clinical detachment of someone checking the stock market, her perfectly parted hair and smug composure in place, though I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers every time she reached for her mug. I didn't speak to her, not because I was sulking, but because the silence between us had developed a new shape overnight, less of a passive sibling standoff and more of a live wire stretched taut between two minds, one misstep away from detonation. Dad wasn't in sight. That didn't surprise me. After last night's quiet confrontation and Amanda's not-so-subtle admission of theft cloaked in concern, I suspected he'd chosen the safest place available to men like him, nowhere. He was probably in the garage, pretending to organize tools he never used or standing on the porch, pretending to appreciate the view of the same driveway he's parked in since the early 2000s. His avoidance wasn't just tactical, it was survival, but for the first time, I didn't feel bad about it. If he was hiding, it meant he knew what was coming, and that meant he deserved to stew in it a little longer. When I finally sat down at the table, not next to Amanda, but diagonally across from her, a seating choice more deliberate than it looked, I opened my laptop and began typing without context or explanation. Nothing important, just a document window, some tapping, enough keystrokes to put everyone on edge. I could see Amanda watching me out of the corner of her eye, her breakfast suddenly forgotten. The sound of typing in a room that feeds on secrets is louder than any scream, and it didn't take long before Mom, her hands still wet from rinsing out the coffee pot, turned and said, "Is everything all right?" It wasn't a real question, and we both knew it. It was an invitation to lie, so I didn't answer at all. Amanda, of course, filled the silence with that falsely casual tone she always used when she wanted to stage a calm facade over boiling water. "Emily's just working on something," she said, her voice breezy, like we were all friends sharing a Saturday brunch, and not co-conspirators at a very slow-burning crime scene. I looked up, locked eyes with Mom, and for the first time in years, I didn't soften my expression or try to smooth things over. "Do you know what Dad's been hiding?" I asked calmly, almost academically. The color drained from her face so fast, it was like someone had flipped a switch. Her hands stilled, and she gave a laugh that sounded more like a hiccup. "Hiding, don't be dramatic." It was the wrong answer, not because it was false, but because it was so practiced that it insulted the moment. I closed the laptop, pushed it away, and stood up slowly, watching as Amanda's fingers clenched around the handle of her mug. "Don't worry," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'm not going to ruin your brunch." I walked away before either of them could respond, my feet light on the polished wood floor that had once been so slippery in socks, when Amanda and I used to race down the hallway as kids. Back when things were simple, before money and resentment and invisible scales tipped everything in her favor. By the time dinner rolled around, the mood had shifted into something colder and sharper. The leftovers had lost their charm, the wine didn't taste quite as celebratory, and every bite was taken with forced pleasantries and eyes that didn't quite meet. Amanda made a show of chatting about her future apartment in D.C., how it had exposed brick and a rooftop view, and Mom hung on every word like it was gospel. Dad finally appeared halfway through the meal, muttering about a phone call, his eyes darting to mine every few minutes, unable to hide the panic he barely managed to swallow. I let it all play out, let the scene unfold like a stage drama, written for an audience that didn't know the ending was already in motion. Then, right as Amanda launched into a story about meeting someone from a senator's office, an encounter she clearly thought would impress me, I leaned forward and asked, "Do you think Dad told you everything before he paid off your loans?" The room went still. Amanda's smile froze. Mom's fork paused in midair. Dad didn't breathe. "What's that supposed to mean?" Amanda asked. Her voice clipped, the first crack in her perfect facade. I smiled, just barely. "I mean, it must be nice, getting everything covered without needing to know where the money came from." Dad coughed, or maybe choked, I couldn't tell. Mom's face flushed, and Amanda's eyes narrowed. She was calculating now, trying to decide whether I was bluffing, whether she should demand details or keep quiet. I let the silence stretch, watching the discomfort bloom across the table like a bruise, and then, casually, I added, "I hope the bank doesn't come knocking when it finds out how the equity line was used." That did it. Dad pushed back his chair so hard it scraped the floor, and Amanda's mouth opened, then closed again like a fish out of water. Mom dropped her napkin, fumbling to pick it up like it could distract her from the storm she'd just realized was real. I stood up, placed my hands on the table, and looked at all three of them, my once proud parents and my flawless sister, now visibly shaken. "There's more," I said, voice low and steady, "but I think I'll save it for later." And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving behind the scent of leftover turkey and the unmistakable stink of a family finally realizing the truth always finds a way to the surface, no matter how long you try to bury it. That night, I barely got my bedroom door shut before my phone buzzed with a message from Mom. "We need to talk, now." And there in her hand, when I opened the study door at her request, was the envelope, creased, opened, and trembling between her fingers like it might explode. "We need to talk about this," she said, and I knew we finally would. The moment I stepped into the study and saw Mom standing there, holding that envelope as though it might bite her, I knew the final curtain had started to rise. Not because anything explosive had happened yet, but because the weight in the room had changed. The kind of shift you feel in your chest before a storm hits, a quiet before the reckoning that only those guilty of something truly irreversible can recognize. And in that instant, she wasn't the version of herself she always projected at family gatherings or to her friends at the country club, but a woman stripped of her practiced composure, clinging to her last illusion of control. The envelope was open now, the edges worn, the letter halfway out like it had been reread several times. And in her eyes, I saw the beginnings of something unfamiliar, uncertainty, maybe even fear. She didn't ask me to sit. She didn't offer explanations or apologies or excuses wrapped in maternal concern. Instead, she held the letter out like a peace offering and said, "Why would he write this and not tell me?" And while her voice was still composed, the way her fingers clutched the paper betrayed her. A slight tremble, barely perceptible, but enough for me to see that whatever she had found inside had rattled her more than she wanted me to know. I took the letter back, not to hide it, but to remind her that whatever was written in those pages, it was mine to own, and it wasn't hers to dissect or spin into something more palatable for the sake of family image. I didn't answer her question, partly because I didn't owe her the clarity she never extended to me, and partly because I knew she wasn't ready to face the truth the letter laid bare. That for years, Dad had quietly been borrowing against the house to cover Amanda's tuition, travel, and postgrad expenses, all without telling her, all without admitting to me that the reason he never offered help wasn't because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't, because there was nothing left by the time I asked for it, or maybe because he believed, in some twisted, broken way, that Amanda's success would justify the risk, and that mine, more unpredictable, wasn't worth the gamble. Mom sat down slowly, as though her legs could no longer carry the weight of what she now understood, and when she looked at me again, there was a hollow sort of recognition in her eyes, like she had finally seen past the narratives she so carefully curated. The golden child, the reliable disappointment, the perfect picture that kept her world from unraveling, and in that pause, I saw her beginning to realize that the whole structure had been rotting from the inside out. "I didn't know," she said, which might have been true, but what struck me wasn't the denial. It was the helplessness behind it. Because this wasn't a woman used to being in the dark, and now that she was, it scared her more than she knew how to articulate. "He told me we refinanced for the kitchen, and then the landscaping. You thought I just didn't matter," I said, not bitterly, but plainly, because sometimes the hardest truths aren't the ones screamed during arguments, but the ones laid down gently, without drama, without malice, like a mirror too clean to look into. There was a long pause before the study door creaked open again, and Dad appeared, his face pale, his lips pressed so tightly together they looked almost bloodless, and in his hand was a second envelope, smaller than the first, marked with my name in the same handwriting, but with a slightly different tilt, like he'd written it after drinking or with hands unsteady from guilt. He didn't speak right away, he just held it out, and I took it, feeling the shift in the air grow heavier, denser, as though we were no longer just having a conversation, but crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said finally, his voice small, not the booming dad voice I remembered from childhood, but something more fragile, more human. At first, it was just supposed to be a loan, just enough to cover Amanda's second year while we waited on scholarships to come through. But then she needed more, and then grad school, and by then we were already in it. I told myself I'd find a way to make it right. But you didn't, I said calmly, steadily, the anger I once thought would be volcanic reduced now to a cold, measured flame. You didn't even try. Dad looked down at the carpet, the same worn beige that's been there since before Amanda left for college, and nodded. No, he said, I didn't. I opened the second envelope slowly, and inside was a check, signed, dated, and made out to me for a figure that made my stomach lurch. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was significant enough to prove he'd known all along what he owed, even if he'd never planned to pay it. Behind it there was a note. No apologies, just a line that read, "If this helps, take it. If not, destroy it." I held it for a long moment, then folded the check in half and slipped it back into the envelope without speaking. I wasn't ready to decide yet. That wasn't something I'd let happen in this room. Not in front of them. Mom cleared her throat, her composure cracking like glass under strain. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. Not because she wanted to know, but because she needed to measure the fallout, to start damage control before the neighbors caught wind that her family wasn't quite the picture-perfect model she'd spent years building. I looked at both of them, the people who had raised me, taught me table manners and how to say please and thank you, who had chosen again and again to invest in the daughter they thought reflected their own success. And I realized they didn't fear what I'd do with the letter or the check. They feared the fact that I now knew the power of silence, and that I could wield it better than any shouted confrontation ever could. "I haven't decided," I said finally, my voice even, without cruelty, but with enough weight to let it hang in the air. "But when I do, you'll find out the same way I did. By surprise." And with that, I walked out, leaving the envelope behind, not because I was finished, but because I wanted them to sit with it, to see it every time they passed through that room, to feel it whispering from the table where it sat like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky overcast with the promise of rain, and as I stepped into my car and closed the door behind me, I realized that while revenge is often loud and dramatic in movies, in real life, the most satisfying kind is the kind that leaves people wondering not what you did, but what you might do next. And I plan to keep them wondering for a long, long time.